The words fell out of Clyde Dalton's mouth like something he had been holding for years, pressing them down behind his teeth every single day since the moment he had first understood what Lenora Merriweather had endured to make this moment possible. His voice came out rough, scratched at the edges, the way a man's voice gets when he is fighting hard to keep it steady and losing that fight by inches. "Pick any horse in that corral," he said, crouching down so that his eyes were level with the little girl's wide, brown gaze. "Your mama worked hard enough to choose." The girl, Ellie, 7 years old with her mother's dark curls and her mother's stubborn jaw, looked up at the corral where 15 horses stood in the afternoon light of the New Mexico Territory, the year 1882, the sun already tilting toward the red rock mesas that cut the horizon into jagged pieces. She did not move immediately. She looked at the horses the way children look at things they have been told they cannot have, with a kind of wondering disbelief that made Clyde's chest tighten until he thought something in there might crack straight through. And Lenora, standing 3 feet behind both of them, pressed her hand over her mouth, because she had not known. She had not known that Clyde had spent the last 4 months quietly, secretly buying every horse in that corral with the money he had earned driving cattle up from the Rio Picos, doing the hard, brutal work of a trail rider at 31 years old, his back aching every morning, his hands cracked and bleeding by the time he reached Albuquerque. She had not known any of it. She had thought the corral belonged to Thomas Greer, the land baron who had been threatening to take her homestead claim since October, who had made her life a series of hidden dangers and forced choices, who had driven her to the edge of something she could not name. She had not known that Clyde Dalton, the man she had spent 4 months trying desperately not to love, had made an ultimate sacrifice of every dollar he owned in this world to give her daughter a horse she had always wanted and never been allowed to ask for. The betrayal she had felt 20 minutes ago, when she had stood in front of the deed, she thought she was reading correctly and believed Clyde had sold her out to Greer, began to unravel like a thread pulled from a badly sewn hem. She had been wrong. She had been catastrophically, heartbreakingly wrong. And now she was standing in the golden light of a New Mexico afternoon, watching the man she loved crouch in the dust beside her daughter, and offer that child the world as casually as if it cost him nothing, when she knew, with her whole body, that it had cost him absolutely everything. She needed to go back to the beginning to understand how she had arrived here, how a woman who had survived so much had nearly destroyed the one true and tender thing that had ever reached for her. Lenora Merriweather had come to the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1882 from the state of Missouri, and she had not come willingly. She had come because staying had become impossible, the way things become impossible when the person holding you in place is finally and irrevocably gone. Her husband, James Merriweather, had died in January of that year, taken by a fever that the doctor in St. Joseph said was unremarkable, just one of those things. But there had been nothing unremarkable about James Merriweather dying. He had been 34 years old and the finest cabinet maker in 3 counties, and he had left behind a wife of 28 and a daughter of 6, and a house full of debts that Lenora had not known existed until the men came to collect them. She had sold everything: the house, the furniture, the tools. She had kept her sewing kit, her mother's Bible, Ellie's rag doll, and the letter from the United States Land Office confirming her homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, a claim James had filed 2 years before he died and never told her about, a dark past decision he had made in secret, apparently with the intention of surprising her someday with a life out west that she had not asked for and did not want. But it was all she had. 160 acres in Torrance County, New Mexico Territory, near a wide flat valley the locals called the Estancia Basin, with good grass and a creek that did not run dry in summer. She had read about it in the letter until she knew every word by heart, and then she had packed what remained of her life into 2 carpetbags and put her daughter on a train and headed toward a life she could not yet imagine. The journey had taken 3 weeks. A train from St. Joseph to Kansas City, another west to Dodge City, and then the most terrifying part, a stagecoach south through the Oklahoma Territory and into New Mexico, through land that looked like another planet, red and vast and indifferent in the way that large things are indifferent to small ones. Ellie had been remarkable through all of it, pressing her face against every window, asking the names of every bird she saw. Lenora had answered every question she could and invented answers for the ones she could not. And at night when the child slept, Lenora sat in the dark and tried to remember how to breathe. They arrived in the town of Manzano in late March of 1882, and Lenora discovered immediately that the territory was nothing like the letters had implied. The land was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and the nearest neighbor to her homestead claim was 7 miles away, and the general store in Manzano was operated by a man named Harlan Price, who looked at her the way certain men look at women traveling alone, like they are something unclaimed, something available. She ignored him. She had become very good at ignoring that particular look. The homestead itself was worse than she had expected and better than she had feared. There was a structure on it, a 2-room adobe house with a packed earth floor, and a fireplace that worked and a roof that did not leak in most places. The previous claimant had abandoned it 2 years before, and someone had been using the small corral at the back of the property for occasional horse pasture, judging by the manure that needed clearing. The creek was exactly as described, clear and cold even in March, running along the eastern edge of the property with a sound like distant music. Ellie said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen and promptly fell face first into it trying to catch a frog. Lenora pulled her out, dried her off, and thought for the first time since January that perhaps things might be survivable after all. The trouble with Thomas Greer did not begin immediately. It began 6 weeks in early May, when a man arrived at her door on a tall roan horse and introduced himself as Greer's land agent. A thin man named Aldous Webb with a smile that did not reach his eyes and a document in his hand that he said she needed to sign. The document, she read carefully, was a lease agreement. It stated that Lenora Merriweather, as a single woman, lacked the legal standing to hold a homestead claim independently, and that her land would be absorbed into the Greer land holdings in exchange for a monthly payment that amounted to roughly what a ranch hand earned in a week. She handed the document back without signing it. "The Homestead Act," she said, keeping her voice level, "does not require a woman to be married to hold a claim. I am the named claimant. My husband filed the claim in my name. I suggest you tell Mr. Greer to consult a more current legal opinion." Aldous Webb had looked at her for a long moment with something behind his eyes that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, and then he had folded the document and left. But Thomas Greer was not a man who accepted a first refusal as a final answer. He was 45 years old and had been building his land empire in the Estancia Basin for 15 years, using a combination of legal maneuvering, social pressure, and the kind of quiet intimidation that never left bruises because it never needed to. He controlled the water rights to 2 of the 4 major creeks in the valley, the contracts for the largest cattle operations, and the goodwill of the county land commissioner, a man named Franklin Dokes who owed Greer money he could never repay. He was exactly the kind of man who would look at a widow from Missouri with 160 acres of good creekside land and see an obstacle, a small one, easily removed. Lenora had not understood the full scope of what she was facing until June, when she went to the land office in the town of Estancia to register her residency, and found that Franklin Dokes had filed a competing claim on her property on behalf of a Greer subsidiary company, citing her husband's death as invalidating the original filing. She had stood in that office for a very long time without speaking. Then she had asked for pen and paper, written down every detail of the filing, the date, the case number, the name of the subsidiary company, and walked back out into the June heat. She needed a lawyer. Lawyers cost money she did not have. What she had was a sewing kit, a good eye for needlework, and the kind of stubbornness that certain women develop when the world has taken everything from them, and they decide, quietly and absolutely, that it will not take one thing more. She started taking in sewing work from the women in Manzano. Mending, alterations, the occasional new dress for someone's wedding or Sunday service. She was skilled and word spread, and within a month she was earning enough to think about saving, even after supplies and feed for the small kitchen garden she had planted, and the 2 chickens she had acquired from a neighboring farm family named Castillo, who had become her first and so far only friends in the territory. The Castillo family, Miguel and Rosa and their 4 children, had a homestead claim 3 miles north, and Rosa Castillo had appeared at Lenora's door one morning in April with a pot of postle and a directness that Lenora immediately trusted. "You are alone out here," Rosa had said, not unkindly. "This is dangerous, not the land. The men who want the land." Lenora had understood what she meant. She had already met Aldous Webb. It was Rosa Castillo who first mentioned Clyde Dalton to her. Not by name at first. Just as a reference, a gunslinger who had been operating in the Estancia Basin for the past year, doing honest work, trailing cattle, occasionally serving as a hired gun for small ranchers and homesteaders who needed someone to stand between them and Greer's various methods of pressure. "He is not what you think when I say gunslinger," Rosa said one afternoon in July, sitting at Lenora's kitchen table while the children played outside and Ellie showed Rosa's youngest daughter how to braid grass into a crown. "He is a tender man, careful. He does not shoot unless there is no other way." Lenora had been skeptical. She had learned, over the course of a hard life, to be skeptical of men being described as tender and careful by women who wish them well. In her experience, the description and the reality rarely matched. She had been wrong about Clyde Dalton too, though it took her considerably longer to admit it. She met him for the first time in mid-July of 1882, and it was not a romantic meeting in any sense of the word. She was in the general store in Manzano, arguing with Harlan Price about the price of flour, which had gone up 15 cents from the week before with no explanation she could verify, when the door opened behind her and someone came in and stood quietly to one side, waiting. She finished her argument, won it by 2 cents because Harlan Price was a man who would back down from a woman who held her ground long enough, paid for her goods, turned around, and nearly walked directly into the chest of a man who was a good 5 inches taller than she had expected. She stepped back. He stepped back. They looked at each other. Clyde Dalton was 31 years old and looked like the territory had been using him for raw material. He was lean in the way of men who work hard and eat when they can, with brown hair that needed cutting and dark eyes that were doing something complicated that she could not immediately name. He wore a plain cotton shirt and worn canvas trousers, and a gun belt that sat easy on his hips in the way of something so habitual it had become part of his body. There was a scar along the left side of his jaw, a thin white line that she would later learn came from a knife fight in 1879 that had not been his fault, though that was a story that took time to arrive at. "Pardon me," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and more careful. "No harm done," she said. She walked past him and out the door, and that was, she thought, the entirety of that. She was wrong about that too. He came to her homestead 3 days later, which should have frightened her but somehow did not, probably because he came in the middle of the afternoon on a Monday when the light was generous, and Ellie was playing in the yard, and there was nothing threatening in his approach, just a man on a brown quarter horse coming up the road at an easy walk like he had nowhere urgent to be. He stopped at the edge of her property. He did not come past the fence line without being invited. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, "my name is Clyde Dalton. I've been told you might be having some difficulty with Thomas Greer's people regarding your land claim." She set down the shirt she was mending and looked at him across the fence. "Who told you that?" "Rosa Castillo," he said. She said nothing for a moment. Ellie had stopped playing and was looking at the man on the horse with the frank, total attention that children give to things they find interesting. "Mister," Ellie said, "your horse has a white foot." Clyde looked down at his horse's left foreleg, where a white sock marking ran from hoof to knee. "He does," he agreed. "His name is Banjo." "That's a funny name for a horse," Ellie said. "He was making a racket the first night I had him," Clyde said. "Couldn't think what else to call something that loud." Ellie considered this and found it satisfactory. She went back to her game. Lenora watched the whole exchange and felt something shift slightly in the composition of the afternoon, though she could not have said what precisely had changed. "What is it you're offering, Mr. Dalton?" she asked. "Nothing you haven't asked for," he said carefully. "Just to let you know that I'm aware of what Greer is doing in this valley, and I think it's wrong. If you need someone to stand witness to anything legal, or if Webb or any of Greer's other men come to your property without invitation, I can be reached in Manzano at the Castillo claim most mornings." It was not an offer to sweep in and save her. It was an offer to be available. The distinction mattered enormously to Lenora, who had spent enough of her life being handled by people who thought they knew better. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton." He nodded, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was not elaborate or theatrical, just a simple acknowledgement, and turned Banjo back the way he had come. She watched him until he was out of sight. Then she picked up her mending and told herself firmly that she was not thinking about him. She was, of course, thinking about him, but she filed it away under the heading of things that were not relevant, which was where she put most of the things that scared her. The situation with Thomas Greer escalated in August, and it did not escalate gently. Aldous Webb came back to her property on a Tuesday morning with 3 men she did not recognize and a new document, this one from the Torrance County Land Commissioner's office, signed by Franklin Dokes, asserting that her claim had been found deficient on procedural grounds and giving her 60 days to vacate. Lenora read the document standing in her doorway with the morning sun behind her. Then she looked at Aldous Webb and the 3 men behind him. "This is fraudulent," she said. "Mr. Dokes does not have the authority to vacate a federal homestead claim. That authority rests with the General Land Office in Washington, and a county commissioner cannot override a federal statute." Webb smiled his non-reaching smile. "Ma'am, I suggest you consult a lawyer." "I intend to," she said. "And when I do, I will also be mentioning that Thomas Greer's agent presented me with a fraudulent eviction notice signed by a county official who has a documented financial relationship with Mr. Greer, which constitutes fraud and likely conspiracy. You might want to mention that to Mr. Greer when you report back to him." The 3 men behind Webb shifted. Webb's smile became slightly less confident. 60 days, he said. "Good day, Mr. Webb," she said, and closed the door. She stood on the other side of the door for a full 2 minutes, shaking, before she let herself take a breath. That afternoon she rode to the Castillo claim, because she did not have a horse of her own and had borrowed Miguel's old gray mare for the trip, and found Clyde Dalton there as Rosa had said she often could, sitting on the Castillo porch helping Miguel repair a section of fence rail that had rotted through. She told him what had happened. She told him about the document, what it said, and what she had said in return. Clyde listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning a piece of wood over in his hands. "You cited the right law," he said, "but Dokes being Greer's man means the county level is compromised. You need to go over his head to the territorial level, which means Santa Fe." "I know," she said. "I need a lawyer who practices in Santa Fe and will work for something other than money I don't have." Clyde set down the piece of wood. "There's a man in Albuquerque," he said. "His name is Samuel Forrest. He's been fighting land grab cases for homesteaders for 3 years. He works on contingency for cases he thinks he can win. You think he'd take mine?" "I think you could convince him," Clyde said. And there was something in the way he said it, not flattery, just a plain statement of his assessment, that made her feel the kind of steadiness she had not felt since before January. They worked out the details together. Clyde would ride to Albuquerque, a 2-day ride south, and make contact with Samuel Forrest, explain the situation, and see whether the lawyer would come to the territory to look at the case. Lenora would stay, continue her work, document every interaction with Webb or Greer's men, and keep the homestead occupied, because occupancy was essential to the legal standing of her claim. It was a plan. It was the first time she had felt like she had a plan in 7 months. She rode back to her homestead in the cooling afternoon air and thought about Clyde Dalton, about the way he listened without trying to take over the thinking, about the way he had said she could convince the lawyer like it was an obvious fact. She thought about the scar along his jaw and the easy way his horse had turned when he called it, and the fact that he had stood on the other side of her fence for the entire conversation without ever suggesting he needed to come inside. She told herself this was still not relevant. Clyde left for Albuquerque the following week and was gone for 11 days, which was longer than expected, though he sent a message via the Manzano mail rider on day 7 saying that he had found Forrest and the situation was promising and he would return when he could. Those 11 days were some of the lonelier days of Lenora's time in the territory. She worked. She sewed. She tended her garden and her chickens, and helped Ellie build a small wooden box for the frog that her daughter had finally, on her 4th attempt, successfully caught from the creek. She documented every morning when she woke and every evening before she slept the unbroken status of her occupancy, writing it in the back of her mother's Bible in her neat, small hand, date by date, because documentation was the only weapon she currently had that she knew how to use. On day 10, Aldous Webb came back. He came alone this time, which was worse in a way she could not immediately articulate, because a man alone sometimes meant a man who was trying something the other men were not supposed to see. He knocked on her door at mid-morning, and when she opened it, he was standing there with no document this time, just his own person and that flat smile and something in his posture that was meant to suggest he was doing her a favor by being there. "Mr. Greer wants me to tell you," Webb said, "that he is prepared to offer you a settlement, $300 cash and a letter of reference for a position as a housekeeper in Albuquerque, in exchange for a voluntary relinquishment of your claim." $300. She had not seen $300 in one place in her entire life. "No," she said. Webb blinked. He had not expected that particular speed of response. "Mrs. Merriweather, I don't think you understand the position you're in. When those 60 days are up, she said, I will still be standing in this house on this land, and Mr. Forrest of Albuquerque will have filed a complaint with the New Mexico Territorial Land Office challenging the procedural validity of Mr. Dokes's order. And if Mr. Greer has been smart enough to consult his own lawyer by then, that lawyer will have told him that the federal homestead statute is not something a county commissioner can set aside, and that his attempt to do so will create a legal record of attempted fraud that Mr. Greer does not want to exist. Webb looked at her for a long time. "I see," he said. "Good day, Mr. Webb." She closed the door and then, for the second time, stood on the inside of it shaking. Ellie appeared from the back room, frog box in hand. "Was that the bad man?" she asked. Lenora looked at her daughter, 7 years old, the same dark curls as the photograph of Lenora's mother at that age, the same stubborn jaw that the Merriweather women had been passing down for 3 generations like a useful inheritance. "Yes," she said. "But he's gone now. Is he going to come back?" Lenora crouched down to her daughter's eye level. "He might," she said honestly. "But every time he does, we're going to be right here. And eventually he's going to understand that we're not leaving." Ellie considered this with the grave seriousness of 7-year-olds facing things they only partly understand. "Okay," she said, and went back to her frog. Clyde returned on day 11, dusty and tired and with Samuel Forrest in tow, a small, quick-eyed man of about 50, with a leather satchel full of documents and a manner that suggested he had been in difficult rooms and come out of them fine. He sat at Lenora's kitchen table for 2 hours and listened to everything she had: the original homestead filing, the fraudulent eviction notice, her written record of Webb's visits, her assessment of the relationship between Greer and Dokes. He asked precise questions and wrote things down in a careful hand, and when he was finished he closed his notebook and looked at her. "This is a good case," he said. "Greer has overreached. Dokes's order is procedurally deficient on its face. The relationship between them is documented enough to suggest improper influence. I believe we can have this resolved at the territorial level within 90 days. What do you need from me?" she asked. "Your testimony," he said, "your documentation, and your continued presence on the land. Don't vacate, don't sign anything, and don't accept any offers of settlement without my review." "None of those things will be a problem," she said. Forrest nodded and began talking about next steps, and Lenora listened carefully. But in the corner of her awareness, she was conscious of Clyde Dalton sitting in the chair nearest the door, the one he had taken without being asked. As if by instinct he had identified the position from which he could most easily intervene if something came through that door that should not. He was not contributing to the legal conversation. He was just there, present and quiet, the way certain things are present in a landscape that you notice you would miss if they were gone. After Forrest left to ride to Manzano for the night, it was just the two of them and Ellie, who had been sent to bed an hour ago and who was, by the sounds from the back room, thoroughly asleep. Lenora put the kettle on. It seemed like the right thing to do. "Thank you," she said without turning around, "for finding him, for making the trip." "It was no trouble," Clyde said. She turned around. He was looking at her with those dark, complicated eyes that she had been trying not to think about for 3 weeks, and she realized that she had been so focused on the practical difficulty of her situation that she had not fully considered what it meant that this man had ridden 4 days in total to help her, for no payment she had offered and none he had asked for. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question came out more direct than she intended, but she had been raised by a woman who thought directness was the only honest approach to things that mattered. Clyde was quiet for a moment. "Because Greer has been doing this to people in this valley for 15 years, he said. "And most of them have been poor enough or frightened enough that they've let him. And I've spent most of the past year watching it and being angry about it and not doing anything particularly useful. And when Rosa told me about you, I thought maybe this time I could actually be useful." It was a good answer. It was an honest answer. It was also, she noted, an answer that said something about him and very little about her specifically, which was either a careful deflection or genuine modesty, and she was not yet sure which. "Is that the only reason?" she asked. The silence was longer this time. "No," he said. She turned back to the kettle. They drank their tea and talked about Forrest's plan and the practical steps of the next few weeks, and at no point did either of them return to the question she had asked or the answer he had given. But it was there in the room with them for the rest of the evening, that single syllable, "no," quiet and present, and entirely too significant to ignore. The weeks that followed had a kind of structure that Lenora had not anticipated, a daily life that was, on its surface, simply the practical business of surviving and building her homestead claim, and underneath that surface, something else growing in the way that things grow in dry country, slowly and out of sight, and then suddenly and all at once. Clyde did not move onto her property or impose himself on her daily life. He was not that kind of man. But he came by regularly, ostensibly to check whether Webb or any of Greer's men had made any moves, practically to sit on her porch in the evening sometimes and talk, or to help with things she would not have asked for help with, like the section of corral fence that had come loose in a summer wind, or the firewood that needed splitting before September turned cold. He taught Ellie the names of the birds she saw from the porch. Not just the common ones, but the specific ones, the pinion jay from the scrub jay, the western meadowlark from the lesser goldfinch. with the patient specificity of a man who had spent a great deal of time alone outdoors with nothing to read. Ellie adored him immediately and without reservation, in the total way that children adore people they have decided are trustworthy. And this, Lenora privately admitted, was the most persuasive evidence in his favor, because Ellie was not an easy child to charm, and she had an instinct for dishonesty that had already proved itself accurate twice. Lenora tried not to let herself love him. She tried very sincerely and with considerable focus, and she failed in the way that sincere and focused people fail at things they are trying not to feel, gradually, and then comprehensively. She identified the moment it became something she could no longer categorize as manageable. It was an evening in early September, the air already cooling toward something that smelled like the change of season, and she had come out to the porch after Ellie was asleep to find Clyde still there, which was later than he usually stayed, and he was sitting with his elbows on his knees looking at the dark shape of the mesas against the stars. And when she came out, he turned to look at her with an expression that she had no previous map for. Completely open in a way she had not seen a man's face be open since James, and James's openness had been easy, comfortable, familiar. This was different. This was a man who was showing her something he did not usually show and was aware of the risk of showing it and was doing it anyway. She sat down in the other chair. "Tell me something true," she said. It was the thing her mother had always said when she wanted to cut through to what mattered. He looked at her for a moment. "I was a hired gun for 4 years," he said. "Not the honest kind of work I do now. Worked for men like Greer back then. Men who needed someone to stand in a doorway and look like a problem worth avoiding. I never shot anyone who didn't shoot first, but I made it possible for people like Greer to do what they do by being present. By being the kind of man they could put between themselves and the people they were hurting." She was quiet, waiting. "I stopped in 1879, he said, "after a situation in Arizona that I'm not going to describe in detail because it isn't something I want to put in your head. But I stopped, and I came here, and I've been trying since then to figure out what it means to use the same set of skills in a direction that doesn't leave you feeling like the bottom of a boot. And," she said, "and some days I think I'm figuring it out," he said, "other days less so." She looked at the stars for a moment. "I was afraid of this place," she said, "when I came. I had never been anywhere that looked like this, and I thought it was going to swallow me. I thought I would be too small for it." "Are you still afraid?" "Some days," she said honestly, "but less than before. It turns out the size of a place is different when you have something to stand on." They looked at the stars together for a while longer, and then he said good night and went to his horse, and she watched him ride away and thought about the dark past he had just handed her voluntarily, the thing he had been doing before he was the person he was trying to be, and realized that what she felt was not judgment but recognition, the particular recognition of someone who understood that a person's present self and their past actions were not always the same thing. She went to sleep thinking about his eyes when he had said, "I'm trying to figure out what it means." She woke up in love with him, which was inconvenient and terrifying, and also, underneath all of that, something she could feel as a warmth she had not felt in a very long time. The legal situation moved according to Forrest's timeline, though not without friction. Greer, when he understood that Lenora was not going to be frightened or bought off, attempted a different approach. He filed a separate complaint with the Territorial Land Office, asserting that Lenora's original homestead filing was deficient because the acreage was falsely described, an argument that had no factual basis, but that required a formal response and created delays. Forrest handled it efficiently, but the delays were real, and they were expensive in terms of time and stress. And in October, Webb came back once more with a new offer, this one for $500, which Greer had apparently decided was worth spending to make the problem go away quietly. This time Clyde was at the property when Webb arrived, and there was a moment in the yard, Webb on his horse and Clyde standing just to the side of the door, where no words were necessary and none were spoken, and Webb understood very clearly that the situation had changed in its composition. He left without making his offer. Greer escalated in response by having one of his men interfere with Lenora's mail, which she discovered in late October when a letter from Forrest that she was expecting failed to arrive, and she eventually found evidence of it having been received in Manzano and not delivered. This was the kind of interference that was meant to isolate and confuse, a hidden motive made practical, and it made her furious in a way that the earlier efforts had not. She went to Manzano and spoke to the postmaster, a man named Albert Gaines, who had the good grace to look ashamed when she laid out what she knew. He admitted under the pressure of her sustained and articulate anger that he had been asked by Webb to hold her mail pending further instruction. "That is a federal crime," she said. "Interfering with the United States mail. I want to know if you understand that." Gaines said he understood it. "Good," she said. "I would like my letter now, and I would like to know that this will not happen again, and I would suggest that when Mr. Webb next approaches you, you tell him that the Postal Inspector's office in Santa Fe has been made aware of this incident, which it will be by letter today." She got her letter. She wrote to the postal inspector. The mail interference stopped. Clyde heard the story that evening and looked at her with an expression she was coming to recognize, something between admiration and something softer. "You are," he said carefully, "the most effective person I have met in a long time." "I'm just angry," she said. "Most people who are just angry accomplish a lot less," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table where they had developed the habit of sitting in the evenings. "Tell me something true," she said, which had become the way they began the conversations that mattered. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I've been trying to find a way to say it that doesn't make things complicated, but I can't find one, so I'm just going to say it plain." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a nighthawk called twice and went silent. "Things are already complicated," she said. "I know. I have a child," she said. "I have a legal fight that isn't over. I have a homestead that might or might not survive the next 60 days. I have nothing to offer anyone in terms of stability or certainty." "I know all of that," he said. "I'm not asking for stability or certainty. I'm just telling you what's true because you asked." She looked at him for a long time. His face was still open in that way she had no map for, patient and honest and not asking her to do anything in particular with what he had given her. "I need some time," she said. "All right," he said. He did not bring it up again. He continued to come to the property, to help with the practical things, to teach Ellie bird names and to sit on the porch in the evenings and talk about ordinary things, and let the weight of what he had said settle between them at whatever pace it needed to. He was, she thought, the most patient man she had ever met, which was perhaps connected to the fact that he had spent years in a profession that required reading a situation exactly right before acting, and had transferred that particular skill to his emotional life in a way that was unusual and that she found, she admitted privately, extraordinary. November came, and with it, a development in the legal case that Forrest sent urgent word about. The Territorial Land Office had reviewed Greer's procedural challenge and found it without merit, and had additionally flagged Dokes's original eviction order for investigation based on the evidence of his financial relationship with Greer. Dokes, apparently understanding what an investigation meant for him personally, had contacted Forrest's office and indicated a willingness to vacate his original order in exchange for the investigation not being expanded to include his other dealings. It was not justice in the fullest sense. It was a compromise of the kind that came when powerful men were caught doing wrong and offered something smaller than what they deserved to accept in exchange for stopping. But it meant that Lenora's homestead claim was secure, that the fraudulent eviction order was gone, and that Thomas Greer had lost this particular engagement. Forrest came to the homestead on the 10th of November to deliver the news in person, which she appreciated because she would have cried reading it alone in the kitchen, and she cried somewhat less with someone present. She cried anyway. Not from relief alone, though relief was part of it, but because she realized sitting in her kitchen on her land in the territory she had been afraid of that she had won, that 7 months of hard work and stubborn refusal, and one borrowed lawyer, and one man who had ridden 4 days to help her had resulted in the thing staying hers. And James was not here to see it, and her mother was not here to see it, and she had done it more or less alone, which was both a triumph and a grief at the same time. Forrest was good about the crying. He gave her the documents and a glass of water and said the things a good lawyer says, practical and kind, and left after an hour. She sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. Then she went to find Clyde. He was at the corral, checking Banjo's shoes, and when she came around the corner of the house, he straightened and looked at her face and said nothing, just waited. "We won," she said. Something moved across his face that was too large and too complicated to be just happiness for her situation. It was something personal, something that had to do with him specifically, and what it meant to him specifically that this had come out the way it had. She understood in that moment more about what the past year had meant to him, the years before this year and the things he had been trying to undo. "I'm glad," he said. His voice was rough. She crossed the distance between them and kissed him. She had not planned to do it, or perhaps she had been planning to do it since September without consciously knowing it. Either way, she did it, stepping up and putting her hands on his face and kissing him in the November morning light beside his horse with the red mesas in the distance and the sound of the creek from the east. He kissed her back after a moment of what she felt as surprise and then a kind of decision, and his hands came up to her waist and held there, careful and present. When she stepped back, they looked at each other for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, "in the kitchen, in October." "I remember what I said in the kitchen in October," he said. "I'm in love with you too," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying it as a response to what just happened. I'm saying it because it's true and I want you to know it's true." The complicated thing that lived in his eyes when he looked at her had resolved itself into something simpler and more direct. "All right," he said. "I still have a child and a homestead and very little certainty," she said. "I know. And you still have a dark past that you're working on. I know that too." "As long as we're clear," she said. "Entirely clear," he said. She kissed him again, which was easier the second time and better. Ellie found them like that, coming around the corner of the house with the frog box in hand to show Clyde something the frog had done, and stopped and stared and then said with the devastating accuracy of 7-year-olds, "Are you in love now?" Lenora and Clyde looked at each other. "Yes," Clyde said. Ellie considered this. "Good," she said. "I told Mama you were nice," and held out the frog box for his inspection. December came in cold and clear, with frosts that turned the grass silver in the mornings, and a sky that was a particular shade of blue that Lenora had not seen anywhere else, and had come to think of as specifically belonging to this place. She was building a life here in a way that had moved past survival into something that felt, carefully and cautiously, like home. She had expanded her sewing work into what was, by local standards, a small business, taking commissions from as far as Estancia and occasionally from women in the ranching families near Moriarty. She had built up enough savings to buy 2 more chickens, and in December, to begin planning the expansion of the kitchen garden for spring. Clyde spent most of December at the homestead, which was an arrangement they had arrived at naturally rather than by formal discussion, though it included the formal reality that he continued to sleep in Manzano at the rooming house kept by a widow named Mrs. Hennessy, because Lenora was clear about what was appropriate before they were married, and Clyde respected that clarity without requiring explanation. The word married had appeared in their conversations in December the way it appears when 2 people are circling a thing they both want but are being careful about, obliquely at first and then with increasing directness. It was Ellie who made it direct. She did this, Lenora later reflected, the way children make things direct, by simply saying the thing that everyone else is walking around. One evening at supper, with the December wind pushing at the adobe walls and the fireplace working well, and the three of them at the table with a pot of beans that Clyde had made from a recipe Rosa Castillo had given him, Ellie looked up from her bowl and said, "Are you going to marry Mama?" Clyde set down his spoon. Lenora looked at her daughter with the complicated expression of a woman who is simultaneously exasperated by and deeply grateful for a 7-year-old's approach to social convention. "That's a question for the two of us to discuss privately," Lenora said. "But are you?" Ellie persisted with the relentless forward pressure of children who have identified a question they consider essential. Clyde looked at Lenora. "Are we?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "I believe we were going to discuss that privately," she said. "We could discuss it right now," he said. "I don't mind an audience. Are you proposing to me in front of my 7-year-old? I'm open to however this goes," he said. Ellie looked between them with intense focus. Lenora set down her own spoon. "Clyde Dalton," she said, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I believe I am," he said. "'Cause you want to," she said. "Not because the situation is asking you to, not because it makes sense practically, because you actually want to." He looked at her steadily. "Because I want to spend my life being in the same place you are," he said. "And I would like Ellie's frog to have a permanent home, and I would like to help you plant that garden in the spring. And I am aware that none of those are particularly romantic things to say, but you asked me to tell you what was true." "Yes," Lenora said. Ellie dropped her spoon. "Yes, what?" she said. "Yes, I'll marry him," Lenora said. Ellie made a sound of absolute satisfaction and picked her spoon back up. They were married in January of 1883, almost exactly a year after James Merriweather's death, which Lenora had thought might feel wrong, but felt instead like the kind of timing that life arrives at on its own, circular and survivable. The ceremony was performed by the circuit minister, who came through Manzano every 6 weeks, a short man named Reverend Caleb Moore, who had a manner of conducting weddings that suggested he genuinely enjoyed the work. Rosa Castillo stood as witness. Ellie stood next to her mother holding the frog box, because she had decided the frog should attend, and there was, as Clyde had noted privately, very little point in arguing with Ellie Merriweather about decisions she had fully committed to. They were married in the morning, and then they rode back to the homestead together in the January cold, the three of them on the 2 horses, Ellie up in front of Clyde on banjo because she had asked, and he had said yes without hesitation, and Lenora on Miguel Castillo's borrowed gray mare that she kept meaning to return and kept finding reasons not to. And the red rock mesas were sharp against the winter sky, and the creek was running low and clear, and the smoke was rising from the chimney of the adobe house on her land. Their land now. He was good at being a stepfather in the way she had hoped and slightly feared to hope for, which was to say he did not try to replace James, who had been Ellie's father for 6 years, and was still present in the child's memory and conversation, but moved alongside that presence the way a new thing enters a space that still holds the shape of what used to be there, carefully and with respect for the dimensions. He and Ellie had a relationship that was distinctly their own, structured around birds and horses, and the particular kind of running commentary that Ellie conducted on everything she observed, which Clyde received with total patience and occasional very dry responses that made the child shriek with laughter. Spring came, and with it, the garden expansion that had been planned, and the arrival of a letter from Samuel Forrest saying that the investigation into Dokes had resulted in the county commissioner's removal from office, and that the Territorial Land Office had issued a formal finding supporting the validity of Lenora's homestead claim in terms that essentially closed every avenue Greer had been pursuing. Thomas Greer, Forrest reported, had retreated to his main ranch holding near Willard, and had apparently decided that the Merriweather homestead was more trouble than its acreage was worth. Whether this represented a genuine change of direction or merely a strategic pause, Forrest could not say. But for now, the danger that had defined her first year in the territory was over. Lenora read the letter twice. Then she went outside and stood in the spring morning looking at her property, the small adobe house and the kitchen garden, and the creek line of cottonwoods turning green in the April warmth, and the corral that she had been thinking about seriously. She had been thinking about the corral because she had been thinking about a horse, not for herself, not yet, but for Ellie, who was 7 going on 8 and who had expressed, with increasing frequency and intensity, a desire for a horse of her own. The gray mare that Lenora still had not returned to Miguel Castillo, who seemed unbothered by this arrangement, was patient and gentle and Ellie could sit on her, but she was not Ellie's horse, and there is a particular difference. Lenora had known since childhood between a horse that tolerates you and a horse that is yours. The problem was the cost. Good horses were expensive. A good horse for a child, one with the right temperament, the right size, the right disposition, was a significant expense on top of all the other significant expenses of building a homestead and a life. She had been quietly, carefully saving toward it for months. She had not said anything to Clyde because she wanted this to be something she gave Ellie herself, from her own work, from the sewing money that she had earned one careful stitch at a time across 7 months of mornings. She had a fierce and private pride in this, in giving her daughter something earned entirely from her own hands, and she did not want it complicated by offers of help, however well meant. What she did not know was that Clyde had been doing something in parallel. He had been driving cattle again in the spring, taking the trail work that paid better than anything else available in the territory, leaving for 3 weeks in April, and coming back tired and thin and happy to be home. And she had understood this as the work it was, and had not asked detailed questions about the money because their finances were still separate in many respects, each contributing to the shared household from their own earnings. She had not known that he had been working toward the same thing she had been working toward, from his direction, in secret, adding to it with the dogged purpose of a man who had identified something he wanted to make happen, and was willing to work as hard as necessary for as long as necessary to make it happen. She had not known that he had spent the first week of May, while she was in Manzano with a commission that kept her away 2 days, quietly purchasing every horse in a new corral he had arranged with a rancher named Bill Harmon who had good stock and a willingness to deal. 15 horses of various sizes and dispositions and temperaments, because he had not been certain which one would be right for Ellie, and he thought, this being the most like him of anything she would ever learn about him, that the best thing to do was to give the child a real choice. He had done this secretly, completely secretly, and he had paid for it with 4 months of cattle driving money, every dollar of which had been earned in the hard way. It was everything he had saved in half a year. She had not known any of it. And then she had gone to the land commissioner's office in Estancia to collect a document related to the final resolution of Greer's challenge, and had seen, in the property transfer records that she was reviewing for her own case, a transfer document for the Harmon Corral acreage adjacent to their homestead, and the name on the transfer was not Bill Harmon's and it was not Clyde's. It was Thomas Greer's. And there was a second document beneath it, a sale agreement for the horses in the corral, also to Greer, and beside that document was a letter, a private letter that had been misfiled with the property records, and the letter was from Clyde Dalton to Thomas Greer. She read it with the kind of careful, complete attention that a person gives to something they cannot believe they are seeing. The letter discussed the horses. It discussed the corral. And in one sentence in the middle of it, Clyde had written, in his plain and distinctive handwriting, that he wanted to be certain the matter was concluded to Greer's satisfaction, and that the arrangement served everyone involved. She stood in the land commissioner's office for 3 full minutes, the documents in her hands, and felt the ground move in a way it had not moved since January a year ago, since the men had come to collect James's debts and the bottom had come out of her life. She had been wrong. He had been working with Greer all along. The help had been a trap. The love had been a hidden motive. She had been used systematically and tenderly to be set up for a betrayal she had not seen coming because she had let herself trust someone she should not have trusted. She put the documents down. She walked out of the land commissioner's office. She rode home. She did not cry. She was too angry to cry and too frightened of what came next to spend any energy on grief. She arrived at the homestead in the early afternoon and found Clyde in the yard, and he saw her face and straightened immediately and said, "What happened?" "I need you to tell me about Thomas Greer," she said. Her voice was very level and very quiet. Something moved in his face. Not guilt, not quite, but something that looked like the recognition of a conversation he had been dreading. "Lenora, tell me about the letter," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he said, "What letter did you see?" And she told him. And he closed his eyes for a second and then opened them, and the expression on his face was not what she expected, not the look of a man caught in the act, but the look of a man watching something he was afraid of happen in a way he could not immediately stop. "The letter to Greer," he said, "was not what you think it was." "It was in your handwriting," she said. "I know. Let me explain it." "Explain it," she said. He explained it. And what he explained was this: that in purchasing the horses for the corral, he had used Bill Harmon as an intermediary, but that Harmon, unknown to Clyde, had a separate dealing with Greer regarding the adjacent land. And when Greer's agent had identified the corral purchase as connected to the Merriweather homestead, Greer had attempted to claim the horses as part of an outstanding debt Harmon owed him. Clyde, discovering this, had contacted Greer directly, not to cooperate with him, but to dispute the claim, and the letter she had read was that dispute. The sentence about concluding the matter to Greer's satisfaction was a threat, not a promise, specifically that if Greer pursued the horses, Clyde would conclude the matter by involving Forrest and the territorial court, which was a cost Greer was not prepared to pay. The property transfer to Greer's name was not the horses. It was the adjacent land, which Harmon had sold to Greer independently months before, and which had nothing to do with the horses or the corral where they now stood. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, the yard was very quiet. Somewhere distant, the creek was running. The red mesas held the afternoon light in their usual patient way. "Show me," she said. He showed her. He had the correspondence, all of it, in a satchel at the house because he was a man who kept records of things that mattered. And within 20 minutes she was sitting at the kitchen table reading the complete exchange between himself and Greer's representatives, which was precisely what he had described: a dispute, a threat, a resolution that had kept the horses where they were. She sat with the documents for a long time. "I was wrong," she said finally. "You read what you had and came to a reasonable conclusion," he said. He was standing by the window, giving her space, which she noted even now. "I believed the worst," she said. "You've had a lot of reasons to," he said. "In the past year." She set the documents down. The betrayal she had felt for the past 3 hours was unraveling, and what was replacing it was something more complex, a combination of relief and shame and a love that felt larger than it had this morning because it had survived a thing she had done to it. "I should have come to you first," she said. "Yes," he said, "but you didn't know what you were seeing. I should have trusted you." He came away from the window and sat across from her at the table. "I would like to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I bought those horses," he said, "for Ellie. All 15 of them, different sizes and temperaments and ages, because I wanted her to have a real choice, a horse that's actually hers. And I paid for them with what I earned driving cattle in April, which was every dollar I had. And I want you to know that I didn't tell you because I wanted it to be something I did myself. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted it to be from me to her specifically. I'm telling you now because I don't want there to be anything you don't know." The kitchen was very quiet. "How much did you spend?" she said. "More than was sensible," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Clyde Dalton," she said, and her voice did a thing she had not planned. "Don't," he said gently. "Don't do that." "Don't do what?" "Don't thank me. It's not for thanking. It's because I wanted to." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "All right," she said. "Where is Ellie?" "She went with Rose's children this morning," he said. "She'll be back before supper." "Good," Lenora said. And then, because she did not know how else to move through the aftermath of having nearly destroyed the best thing in her life out of fear, she got up and went to him and put her arms around him the way she had learned in 8 months of marriage to put her arms around a person who was solid and real and actually present. He held her with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, complete and quiet. "I'm sorry," she said into his shoulder. "Already forgiven," he said. "You forgave me before I asked." "Yes," he said. She pulled back to look at him. His face was still open in that way that she had no map for, the same openness that had undone her in September when she had been trying very hard not to be undone. "I love you," she said. "That's the true thing." "I know," he said. "That's my true thing too." Ellie came back from the Castillo farm at 6 o'clock trailing Rose's youngest daughter, and carrying a new drawing she had made of the frog. And Clyde made supper while Lenora helped the children wash up. And they ate together in the way they had been eating together for 8 months, which was the way a family eats, without formality, but with the particular warmth of people who are genuinely glad to be in the same room. After supper, when Rose's daughter had been walked part way home by Clyde and retrieved by Miguel, who met them on the road, and Ellie was in the back room beginning the ritual of going to sleep that involved 3 questions about bird names and 2 requests for water that she did not actually drink, Lenora stood on the porch in the May evening and felt the territory around her in a way she had not felt it in the afternoon. It was hers. Not in the way that scared her anymore, not the too large and indifferent vastness she had arrived to in March, but in the way that places become yours when you have fought for them and stayed and built something inside them. The mesas were dark shapes against a sky still holding the last of the light. The creek was talking to itself in the east. The smell of the supper fire was still in the air. Clyde came out and stood beside her. "Tomorrow," he said, "I thought we might show her. The horses," she said, "if you think she's ready." "She's been ready since she was 3, Lenora said. "She asked James for a horse when she was 4 and he told her when she was older, and she's been patient about it ever since." "She's a patient child," he said. "She gets it from her father," Lenora said. And then, because it was the territory of honest conversation that they had developed between them, "James, I mean." "He was patient too, in different ways," Clyde nodded. "Tell me about him," he said. She looked at him. "Are you sure?" "I'm asking," he said. So she told him about James Merriweather, the cabinet maker from Missouri, the quiet man who had had a gift for wood and had loved her steadily and without drama for 6 years, and had died in January without warning, and left a letter in his desk drawer that she had found 3 weeks after the funeral. A letter telling her about the homestead claim he had filed in New Mexico, explaining that he had always wanted to take her somewhere new and large and surprising, somewhere worthy of her. He had written, which had made her cry in a way she had not expected. Clyde listened to all of it, and when she was done he said, "He sounds like a man who loved you in the ways he was capable of." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right. I intend to love you in every way I'm capable of," he said, "and I keep discovering I'm capable of more than I thought." She looked at the mesas. "That's the most romantic thing you've said to me in 8 months, she said. "I've been working up to it," he said. She laughed genuinely, the laugh that had come back to her gradually since March, returning in pieces like a thing assembled from scattered parts. The morning they showed Ellie the horses was one of those New Mexico mornings in May that seem personally designed to be beautiful, clear and warm with a light breeze coming off the mountains to the west, and the kind of sky that makes people who have lived under it all their lives stop for a second and look up. They walked together to the corral, the 3 of them, Ellie between them holding Lenora's hand on one side and Clyde's on the other, which was a position she had taken up without being asked sometime in the winter and maintained as a preference ever since. She was 8 now, her birthday having been in March, and she wore her hair in the long single braid that she had decided was the correct hairstyle following a lengthy consideration of the options. The corral came into view around the side of the house, and Ellie stopped walking. The horses were there in the morning light, 15 of them, bay and sorrel and gray, and one particular small roan mare with a white blaze on her forehead that Lenora had privately already decided was the one, though she kept that to herself because it was Ellie's choice to make. Ellie looked at the horses. She looked at the corral. She looked up at Clyde. He crouched down. His voice was rough at the edges, the way voices get when there is something large sitting behind them. "Pick any horse in that corral," he said. "Your mama worked hard enough to choose." Lenora pressed her hand over her mouth. "Because that was it, wasn't it? That was the full weight of it," said plainly in the voice of a careful and tender man in the May morning. Her work had made this possible. His love had made it happen. And Ellie, standing between the two of them in the light, with the horses in the corral and the mesas in the distance, and the creek singing in the east, had the choice that neither of them had been able to give her from any easier position. Ellie looked at the horses for a long time. "That one," she said, pointing without hesitation to the small roan mare with the white blaze. "She's been looking at me since we got here." Clyde looked at Lenora over Ellie's head. Lenora lowered her hand from her mouth and let him see her face, which she knew was showing everything she had. He looked at her with those dark, complicated eyes that had become, over 8 months of marriage and a year before that of learning each other, the most familiar and important thing in her landscape. "Good choice," Clyde said to Ellie. They went into the corral together, Clyde showing Ellie how to approach the roan mare from the right angle, hand out and low, letting the horse come to her rather than moving toward the horse. The mare did come, exactly as Ellie had said she would, moving forward and pressing her nose to the child's palm with a softness that made Ellie go completely still with wonder. Lenora stood at the fence and watched her daughter and her husband in the morning light with the horse between them, and felt the specific fullness of a moment that she had not known to want until it was happening, which was, she thought, the way the best things arrive. Over the following weeks, Ellie named the roan mare Blossom, which was argued against by no one, and began the serious work of learning to ride properly. Clyde taught her with the same patient specificity he applied to bird identification, working through the basics with a methodical care that Lenora watched from the porch with her sewing, and a feeling of deep and settled happiness. Summer came back to the territory, the dry, fierce summer that Lenora had survived once and understood now, and she expanded her garden and her sewing business and began, in the long June evenings, learning from Rosa Castillo how to make the preserved foods that would carry them through the winter with more variety than last year. Rosa was a generous teacher and a good friend, and the two women had developed the kind of friendship that forms between people who have recognized each other as capable of being trusted, the deepest kind. In July, Lenora discovered that she was expecting a child. She sat with this information for a day before she told Clyde, not from any reason of secrecy, but from wanting the private time with it first. The hours of sitting with a thing that is both enormous and intimately familiar when you have been through it before, and knowing at the same time that this was entirely different from the first time because every condition of her life was different. She told him on a Tuesday evening on the porch, after Ellie was asleep. She said it plainly, the way he had taught her to say the things that mattered, no preamble and no softening, just the fact. He sat very still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her with something on his face that she had never seen there before, something that made her think of the word tender in its oldest sense, the sense of something that has been touched in the exact place where it is most alive. "All right," he said, which was, coming from Clyde Dalton, a complete and entire response. "Is that all you have?" she said. He reached over and took her hand. "I'm trying to find more words," he said. "Give me a moment." She waited. "I am," he said slowly, "the most fortunate person I know. I am aware that's a strange thing for a man with my history to say. But I look at what my life is right now here, with you and Ellie and Blossom and the frog and the creek and the mesas and the garden, and I cannot identify a single element of it that I would change. And now you're telling me there's going to be more of it. And I don't have words for that beyond the fact that it seems like something I don't entirely deserve." "You do deserve it," she said. "I'm working on believing that," he said. "Work faster," she said. He laughed, the genuine laugh that was quieter than hers but just as real, and she leaned into his side and they sat on the porch together in the July night with the stars enormous overhead and the creek talking to itself in the east and the sound of Ellie sleeping in the back room and Blossom moving quietly in the corral. And everything was, for once and completely, where it was supposed to be. The pregnancy was not difficult, which Lenora was grateful for, having had a sufficiently difficult year already, and being privately of the opinion that the universe owed her a smooth passage on this particular matter. She continued her sewing work through the fall and slowed slightly in November and December as the baby moved from theoretical to insistent. She was healthy, strong, and managed by a practical midwife from Manzano named Clara Hutchins, who had 30 years of experience and a manner that brooked no nonsense from pregnant women or the people who loved them. Clyde was magnificent through all of it. Not in an excessive or hovering way, which would have driven Lenora directly to madness, but in the practical and attentive way that was his nature applied to new circumstances. He learned what Clara required of him, did it without complaint or drama, and directed his concern into useful channels like making sure there was always wood for the fire and the right things in the larder, and that Ellie, who was following the pregnancy with intense scientific interest and no social filters whatsoever, was gently managed when her questions became more than even Lenora's considerable patience could address. The baby was born in January of 1884, exactly 2 years after James Merriweather's death, on a cold, clear night when the stars were very bright and the coyotes were making themselves heard in the distance and the fireplace was working perfectly. He was a boy. They named him James Clyde Dalton, which was Lenora's idea and which she offered quietly a day after his birth, watching Clyde's face when she said it. He looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were doing the complicated thing. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. James was a good man and he is Ellie's father and he made it possible for us to be here. And Clyde is the name of the man who kept us here. I want both of those things in his name." Clyde nodded once carefully. "All right," he said. Ellie, when informed of the name, expressed satisfaction with James and then queried at length about the Clyde portion, until Rosa Castillo, who was visiting, redirected her attention to the baby's fingers, which were a source of fascination sufficient to derail most lines of inquiry. Little James, who acquired the nickname Jamie within the first week because Ellie decided it was more suitable, and no one had the energy to disagree with her about it, was from the first a cheerful and robust baby who slept in longer stretches than Lenora remembered Ellie doing, and whose primary mode of expressing contentment was a sustained and earnest gurgling that Ellie found endlessly entertaining, and that Clyde listened to with the expression of a man attending a very good musical performance. The winter of 1884 was the first winter in the territory that Lenora experienced as something other than a thing to be survived. They had enough wood, enough food, enough warmth in the adobe house that Clyde had spent the fall improving, the roof now entirely reliable, and the gaps in the walls filled with the mud and straw mixture that Rosa had taught them. They had the baby and the child and the horse and the frog, who was, against all odds, still alive in his box, and apparently thriving on a diet of flies that Ellie provided with religious consistency. Thomas Greer made one final attempt in February of 1884, so indirect it barely qualified as an attempt. He sent a new agent, not Webb, who had apparently moved to Colorado, but a younger man named Pierce, who arrived at the homestead with a document that was so transparently a retread of arguments that had already been decided that Lenora read it and then handed it to Clyde, who read it and handed it back. "I'll write to Forrest," Lenora said to Pierce. "Ma'am, I'll write to Forrest today," she said. He'll have this before the end of the week. Mr. Greer is welcome to litigate a settled matter in the territorial court if he chooses to, but I would suggest that the money he will spend doing so could be better applied elsewhere." Pierce left. She wrote to Forrest. The territorial court issued a brief and somewhat impatient ruling 3 weeks later, affirming the previous finding and noting that further challenges to this claim would be considered frivolous. Thomas Greer did not send anyone else. Spring came again, the second spring, and it was different in every way from the first. The garden was larger. The chickens had multiplied to 8. The homestead had the look of a place that had been lived in and cared for. The small improvements of 2 years of attention visible in the fence lines and the garden beds, and the path worn smooth between the house and the corral. Blossom had become the horse she had promised to be, absolutely devoted to Ellie, who rode her every morning before school. Because there was now a school, a small territorial school in Manzano that had opened in the fall of 1883, and that Ellie attended with a seriousness of purpose that suggested she was going to be, in Clyde's assessment, either a teacher or a lawyer. Jamie learned to sit up in March and to crawl in April with a determination that suggested he had decided locomotion was his primary project for the season. He was a solid, bright-eyed baby who had Lenora's dark curls and, Clyde said, her stubborn jaw, which Lenora said was not possible in a 10-month-old, and which Clyde maintained was entirely obvious. In May, almost exactly a year after the morning with the horses, Lenora was sitting on the porch in the evening with Jamie asleep in the cradle beside her and Ellie inside learning her letters from the reader that Clyde had brought back from Albuquerque. And Clyde came and sat in the other chair the way he always did in the evenings, and she reached over and took his hand the way she always did. "Tell me something true," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm happier than I thought I was allowed to be," he said. "You're allowed to be whatever you are," she said. "I'm learning that," he said. The mesas held the last of the day's light. The creek was talking. The baby breathed steadily in the cradle. From inside came the sound of Ellie reading her letters aloud, stumbling over a word and correcting herself with the tenacity that was entirely her own. "This is it," Lenora said. "Not a question." "This is it," he said. They sat in the settling evening, the two of them and the sleeping baby and the sound of the child inside, and the horse in the corral and the territory all around them, vast and red, and full of the particular kind of beauty that belongs to places that have asked something hard of you and received it. 2 years later, in the spring of 1886, their daughter was born. She came in April in the same quiet way that Jamie had come, managed by Clara Hutchins, who at this point had become a regular presence in their lives, and who said after the delivery that Lenora Dalton was the most composed birthing woman she had worked with in 30 years. "I have practice," Lenora said. They named the girl Rosa Elena Dalton, the first name for Rosa Castillo, who had been her first friend in the territory, and had earned it in every way a person can, the second a version of her grandmother's name on Lenora's mother's side. Rosa Castillo wept when she heard the name, which was the only time Lenora had seen the woman cry, and then recovered herself and brought Postle, which was her answer to most significant occasions. Ellie, at 11, was decisive and expert about the baby in the way of older children who have been through this once already and consider themselves authorities. She designated herself primary assistant and carried out this role with a thoroughness that occasionally required gentle rerouting by both parents. Jamie, at 2, regarded the new baby with the philosophical acceptance of toddlers who have not yet developed the concept of competition, and offered the infant his wooden horse toy on her second day of life, which Clyde said was the most magnanimous gesture in the household's history. The homestead was full. It was, in the most complete and literal sense, a home. There were still difficult days. There were days when the work was too much and the money was tight, and the territory was unforgiving in the way it sometimes chose to be, drought or frost, or the simple grinding reality of building a life from the ground up with your own hands, in a place that had not been designed for ease. There were days when Lenora felt the weight of everything she had carried, the grief of James and the fear of the first year, and the near destruction she had nearly caused by not trusting the one person who had never given her a reason not to. And there were days when Clyde sat with his own history in a way she recognized as the ongoing work of a man making peace with a past that still came to find him sometimes in the small hours when the adobe house was quiet. She had learned to sit with him on those nights without requiring that he speak, and he had learned that her sitting there was what he needed. And this was, she thought, what marriage actually was, not the ceremony but the accumulated knowledge of what a person required in the dark. But the good days were more. The mornings in the garden with the children underfoot and the mountains on the horizon, and the light doing what the New Mexico light did, performing its daily, extraordinary, ordinary miracle. The evenings on the porch with Clyde and the babies and the creek and the stars. The school days when Ellie came home full of something she had learned and had to tell them immediately and completely. The mornings when Jamie called for his father before he called for anyone else, and Clyde went to the back room and came out with the boy in his arms with the expression of a man who has understood exactly what the most important things are. There was a morning in the fall of 1886, the aspen on the eastern mesa having gone to gold, and the air having that particular clarity that comes to the territory in October, when Lenora was standing in the yard watching Ellie ride Blossom in a circle around the corral, with the competence of a girl who had been riding seriously for 3 years, and Jamie was sitting in the dirt beside the gate making something he called a road out of pebbles, and baby Rosa was asleep inside. And Clyde came to stand beside her with 2 cups of coffee, both made correctly, because after 4 years he knew exactly how she took it. He handed her the cup and they stood watching Ellie ride. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "When I came here," she said, "I thought the best I could hope for was surviving it. I didn't think about good. I didn't think good was a thing that was available to me anymore." And now, he said, she looked at him. At the face she had been learning for 4 years and was still learning, the face of a careful and tender and complicated man who had ridden 4 days to help a woman he had only just met and had never asked for anything in return, who had spent every dollar he had on 15 horses so a little girl could have a real choice, who had crouched in the dust of the May morning and told her daughter, in that rough and honest voice, that her mama had worked hard enough to choose. "Now," she said, "I think this is the happiest I have ever been." He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that she had been reading for 4 years and still found new things in. "I feel the same," he said. "That's my true thing." She leaned into his side the way she had been leaning into his side since the first cold night they had sat on the porch together, when she had been trying not to love him and failing, and he put his arm around her the way he had learned to, firmly and without hesitation, and they stood together in the October light watching their daughter ride and their son build his pebble road, and the mesas hold the season's gold like they had always been holding it and always would. The creek was singing. The sky was the particular New Mexico blue that Lenora had decided belonged to this place, and to them. The baby would wake soon and want feeding, and the chickens needed seeing to, and there was sewing waiting on the table inside and fence to check on the south line, and the 100 ordinary requirements of a life that had been built stitch by careful stitch from nothing. All of it waited. All of it was real and good and theirs. Ellie called out from the corral, something about what Blossom had just done, her voice carrying across the October morning with the particular clarity of children's voices in open country. And Clyde turned and called back, and Jamie looked up from his pebble road and added his own comment, which was not entirely related to Ellie's observation, but was enthusiastic. And Lenora stood in the middle of all of it and felt the land under her feet, her land, her 160 acres of Torrance County, New Mexico territory, with the creek at the east and the mesas at the horizon and the adobe house behind her and the corral to the left and her family in front of her, and thought that James Merriweather had been right about one thing at least. It was worthy of her. All of it was.